Welcome to JGTCR, I'm Cope, and today we are tuning the Audi R8 Coupe V10 Plus. Let's get into it. In factory trim, this Audi R8 does not drive well. It seems to be in constant need of correcting in one way or another. For the most part, everything we do equals oversteer. Accelerating, braking, and turning all induces oversteer very quickly. The bottom line is that this Audi R8 is lacking in stability. So handling wise, it is considerably floaty. When it comes to power, there is plenty on hand to propel the car forward. Unfortunately, the power delivery is too aggressive and easily destabilizes the vehicle. As such, we must corner in low RPM or a higher gear to be effective. If we do dare to venture into the higher RPM while cornering, we often find ourselves oversteering and or understeering. Even mild and sweeping turns can initiate over-understeer issues that send us on grass mowing expeditions. The brakes on this R8 are horrible. If we even glance at the brakes, the tail kicks out and we have to start correcting. So we must be extremely cautious when applying the brakes, making sure we are as straight as possible and to modulate the input. But even if we do everything right, we should always expect this Audi to kick out till the very last moment. This can make braking from high speed a very tedious task indeed. Let's collect our time. 7 minutes 8.6 seconds. On to the race tune. Our tune has focused on trying to gain stability for the R8 Coupe. Our suspension is set up with a body height adjustment slightly lower at the rear than the front. Our natural frequency is also more firm at the rear than the front. This is to reduce some aggressive weight shifting we were having at the rear of the vehicle. Our differential settings are maxed completely except for the front acceleration and braking sensitivity, which are reduced to 30 points. This is to reduce the torque steering effect. Let's see it in action on the Nürburgring. When completely modified and tuned, this Audi R8 Coupe is far more stable, but it still does have stability issues. It still feels very floaty boaty McBoatface, even with maximum downforce and a very firm suspension setup. High-speed four-wheel drive drift is commonplace, if not vigilant on taking correct lines at correct RPM. Power delivery is extremely aggressive, far more than before. We must be in an almost dead straight line to not get pulled off the track when we go full throttle. Should we get on the gas a touch too early, the car still pulls wide. Only now, it's much wider. A touch more rear-wheel drive bias may be in order. When it comes to braking, it has improved a lot. However, the issue of the tail kicking out is still present when braking heavily. Let's jump ahead and collect our time. 5 minutes 59.5 seconds. And now the drift tune. A fairly standard drift tune for the Audi R8 Coupe. The natural frequency of the suspension at the rear is softer than the front. Our differential settings are maxed except for acceleration and braking sensitivity at the front, and our front-rear torque distribution is biased completely to the rear. We were having some issues with the tail end being a little too snappy tom, so we added some ballast of 60 points at a ballast positioning of -40. Let's go drifting. The Audi R8 Coupe V10 Plus can drift, but it's not a happy camper while doing so. There is a constant degree of defiance that we must contend with when drifting, and it gets old very quickly. The front end of this Audi is always trying to have its say about what should be going on during the drift. And while it thinks it knows better, it's actually the opposite of what we are trying to achieve. This kind of interference from the front wheels can be remedied with a jib of the handbrake, but it does come at the cost of compromising our line as it forces us to go wider. When it comes to power and power delivery, there is plenty on tap to get us and keep us drifting. But the higher we go in RPM, the more understeer we experience. So to maintain the most amount of control, it is best to use a higher gear and lower RPM. So while this Audi R8 can drift, its caveats and nuances do not make it an ideal drift car to use in drift lobbies. And now it's time for the engine swap. The Audi R8 Coupe V10 Plus with just the engine swap is horrible. Absolutely horrible. Pairing an unstable vehicle with traction issues for every input type with a heavy, super torquey engine is ridiculous. To even begin to have control of this R8, we have to drive it like it's a vehicle from Grand Theft Auto, where the mission states if you bump into anything, the vehicle will explode because there's a bomb in the trunk. Yes, the amount of caution necessary to drive this Audi is unruly. To make decent headway on completing a lap, we must use top gear, and only downshift to rotate the vehicle in turns. But upon exit, we must ensure we are back in 7th gear or suffer the consequences. The handling outcome of this swap is more than likely the worst experienced on GT7 so far. This R8 can start sliding for absolutely no reason at all. The abhorrent weight shift kills most of the ability to take corners. The power delivery is far too aggressive to do anything with. And the brakes, well, they're not too much help at all. When approaching a turn, we need to start braking back in 1942. And if we weren't born then, well, too bad, we're not making the corner. Thanks for listening to my TED Talk. Now let's collect our time. Seven minutes, 3.3 seconds. And now it's tune time. This R8 Coupe with the engine swap was in desperate need of some tuning. With such an increase in power, our focus had to be on taming the rear end. Our suspension at the rear is more firm than the front. However, the suspension is overall softer than our factory engine equivalent to try and get more traction while cornering. Our differential settings are maxed except for acceleration and braking sensitivity, which have both been reduced to 20 points, but could even be set lower to 10 points each. Our front-rear torque distribution was also changed to a ratio of 35 to 65. Again, this could also be changed to a 30-70 ratio if torque steer/understeer is still a problem. Let's head back out to the Nürburgring. When completely modified and tuned, the Audi R8 Coupe V10 Plus with the engine swap is at least drivable. It performs much better overall, but still has some poor qualities. The handling can be very tail happy and snappy tom. At the same time, it can also turn into Mr. Plow and understeer right off the circuit on a whim. It really is the dealer's choice, but the Audi is the dealer. The benefits of tuning is that the R8 is now more stable. We have more control over the vehicle and can now drive more confidently. But we must become accustomed to the vehicle's quirks if we want to lay down decent times. The power delivery is very aggressive and pulls the car off the track if we are not completely straight before going full throttle, so plan appropriately and use caution. The brakes work okay, but can be sketchy at times. Especially if the road surface is uneven or bumpy, we can expect the tail end to step out. And with all the extra weight on board, slowing down takes a bit more time, so move braking markers as required. Let's collect our time. 5 minutes 57.2 seconds. And now the drift tune. We had to use some very aggressive tactics to get this R8 Coupe with the engine swap to drift. Our suspension setup is extremely firm up front and soft on the rear. Our differential sees our initial torque, both front and rear, maxed at 60 points, while acceleration and braking sensitivity are at 5 and 10, front and rear respectively. This is to manage the aggressive nature of power delivery. We also added the maximum of 200 kilos of ballast at a ballast positioning of -25. This is to manage the tail end as it was very snappy tom in nature. Let's drift Suzuka. The Audi R8 Coupe V10 Plus with the engine swap has plenty of power to drift, but unfortunately the chassis and driveline combo is just not having it. The same issues that plague the factory-engined R8 are again present in the engine-swapped version, and in certain aspects it does appear to have gotten worse. The front end of this Audi appears to be doing its own thing, and it does not seem to care if we approve or not. The fight for control over the front end sometimes leads to understeer. Again, we can make corrections with the handbrake, but it does come at a cost of a wider drift line. There is an incredible amount of power and torque available to drift, but effectively getting it down to the ground is where the problem lies. At higher RPM, there is less control available to manage our drift, so it's best to stay in the higher gears and use the copious amounts of torque from the bottom end of this engine swap to keep the drift going. The additional weight over the rear wheels does stabilize the vehicle, but it does mean we have to use smoother transitions, so it's best to use a style of drift that's slow, smooth, and lazy. The Audi R8 Coupe V10 Plus does not hold up well to scrutiny. In factory trim, it is a slippery and sketchy drive, and we are constantly making corrections to keep it on track. When completely modified and tuned, this Audi improves quite a bit. Unfortunately, the lack of stability remains. As a drift car, it is defiant and falls short of being even mediocre. With only the engine swap in factory trim, this R8 becomes the worst version of itself. The only way to drive it well is to put it into 7th gear and drive extremely cautiously, and that's just not racing. When completely modified and tuned, this Audi R8 reaches its final form, and while this is the best version of itself, when trying to drive it hard, it can feel like trying to wrangle a stubborn donkey. And yes, it is fast, but it's not that fun to drive. And in the drift arena, it has the power but lacks the format to be a decent drift car. And that's all we have for you today, so until next time, keep racing!